Good afternoon or good evening for those of you joining us online from other time zones. I'm Roland Green, Director of the Stanford Humanities Center, and it's our pleasure to have you join us at the Harry Camp Memorial Lecture, our last public event of 2022. Besides those of you who are here in Leventhal Hall, we have many more people in our online audience, including a number of former fellows whom we're always glad to see again, whether in person or remotely. I'm tempted to say that if you're watching this on Zoom and you're nonetheless in the area, the rain has stopped. Come on over. We have a beautiful reception ready to go right after this event, and we would love to have you. For those of you that are elsewhere and unable to rush over, we will raise a glass to your health at the reception and hope you can join us next time. Anyway, whoever you are out there and whoever you are in here, former fellows, past, current fellows, members of the Stanford community, or just an interested person, we hope you will want to join us often. The Camp Memorial Fund was established in 1956 by friends and associates of Harry Camp, a businessman and philanthropist in San Francisco, described as a gentle and wise humanitarian. The lecture is usually presented every other year, but our calendar became somewhat scrambled during the pandemic, and we find ourselves convening for this series only 6 months after the last event, and the time before that was 4 years ago. In any case, we're really glad to be able to welcome you and especially our speaker in person. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to mention to the remote audience that real-time captioning is available. Please click on the closed caption icon at the bottom of the screen where it says CC to start or stop viewing the captioning. The up arrow next to the CC icon permits you to show subtitles, view the full transcript, or adjust captions as needed. Now, as some of you know, the Stanford Humanities Center is unusual among university-based humanities centers in that we do several things at once. We house a large number of fellows working on their own projects. This year, we have nearly 50 under our roof. We sponsor research workshops to foster collaboration, and we hold other events that are like this that are open to the Stanford community and beyond. Many of our peer universities divide these functions among 2 or more centers, and we're among the few that sponsor all 3 at that scale. These activities complement and improve each other. The fellows find their work enlivened by the visiting speakers, while the visitors encounter a receptive audience that includes not only Stanford scholars and students, but many others who have met for the year at this intellectual crossroads. In our public events, a hybrid format like today's is our new normal. So we're pleased to be able to welcome current and former fellows, faculty, grad students, undergraduates, and the community in both in-person and online conversation. There'll be an opportunity for Q&A after the talk, and we hope those of you in person, of course, will stay for the reception indoors on the other side of the building. And finally, for the members of our virtual audience who would like to submit a question, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we will do our best to get to it after the lecture. And please note that today's lecture is being recorded and will be available in coming days. Gregory Levine, finally, is professor and chair of the Department of the History of Art at University of California, Berkeley, where he teaches the art and architecture of Japan, Buddhist visual culture, and eco-art history. His current book project, which is the basis of today's lecture, is titled A Tree and a Buddha, Imagining Arboreal Humanism. A projected trilogy on global Buddhist visual cultures includes a book that appeared 4 years ago, Long Strange Journey on Modern Zen, Zen Art, and Other Predicaments. That book is in the lobby for anybody that wants to consult it after the lecture. Buddha Heads, the projected titles, Buddha Heads, Fragments and Landscapes, and Other Buddhas, White Supremacy and Buddhist Visual Culture. Recipient of the Guggenheim and other fellowships, he is an editorial board member of Artibus Asiae and the Journal of Art Historiography. His courses at Berkeley introduce Buddhist temples and icons in Japan, global Buddhist visual cultures, eco-art history, and the dark side of art, in other words, plunder, iconoclasm, and forgery, and the fragment in visual material culture. We have been looking forward to this for a long time. It's so good to be able to welcome Greg in person. Let's give him a big welcome.
Good afternoon, good evening, everybody, and thank you so much, Roland, for a wonderful introduction. And it's a great honor to be here to give the camp lecture. And it's a great joy to be back on the Stanford campus and to be in this room itself. A bit of full disclosure, there is no Zen in this talk, so hopefully half the room won't depart. It is a talk that's part of a kind of a swerve in my own research, my own thinking, my own practice towards environmental humanities, and you'll be hearing a bit about that. It's also a talk today that has a little bit less strict or conventional art history than I'm used to, which is part of why I'm interested in this topic. And I look forward to your questions, comments, suggestions, skepticism, and whatever else my words prompt. For a moment, let's imagine an arboreal humanities, ways of thinking about trees and forests in the humanities and the humanities among trees and forests. This is a risky proposition. Even if the word arboreal carries with it something primal that can sort of take us away from our flickering and noisy lives. Of course, one might also propose an Arctic humanities or a fungal humanities, and certainly a zoonotic humanities would be something on all our minds, if not in our bodies. Which prompts another question, which is, what's wrong with the environmental humanities, a more straightforward, more inclusive, broader term? And more to the point, perhaps, how will an arboreal humanities square with the post-human, the inhuman, the meta-human, the non-human, the a-human, and so forth and so on? And if there is to be an arboreal turn, and the turn being this kind of overused, tired academic kind of concept, you would be very well in your place to ask, how will this arboreal turn out, and for whom? Clearly then, the arboreal humanities should be walked and talked out, tried and modified, and then I think composted, to use one of Donna Haraway's favorite terms, so that an arboreal humanities turns up somewhere else as something else. It may be best then to begin quite simply by beholding trees, forests, and interrelated lifeways. Now, if beholding sounds rather passive, we might also want to think of beholding as reckoning. Reckoning with our arboreal relationships with trees as species, with arboreal ecosystems, and also their communities, inclusive of our own species. We might also need to reckon with violence, with what the late Mike Davis called the plagues of capitalism, and with forces that threaten, in David Theo Goldberg's words, our futureful futures, those of forests, ourselves, and of course, the earth as a whole. We might also think of beholding as reckoning in relationship to what feminist, indigenous, and queer writers refer to as radical care, and what one environmental policy scholar has recently called a care-centered politics. Care as an idea and practice threads through this talk with different strands. For example, care as burden and worry to be driven away, but also care as recognition and support as a countervailing power to oppression, and care as recognition. This is to ask, how might we imagine our arboreal humanities not as an academic field, but as a practice of care. Clearly, I'm not much of an artist. But let me begin with these pages of field notes, my own scrawled, awkward field notes from a forest whose reputation is as large as its foundation species, the coast redwood. Lume, in the language of the Coast Miwok, or Sequoia sempervirens in Linnaean classification. A forest astonishing in scale, biomass, and age. It is also, however, a forest haunted by exclusion and violence. And with damage to our biosphere, this forest too has come to display signs preceding the end of the world, to borrow from the Mexican novelist Yuri Herrera. How might this forest of astonishment become more so a forest of care for and with others? Now, you'll have already ventured a guess as to the identity of this forest, I suppose, and I'll name it shortly. But to imagine a politics of care in relationship to this forest, I should first acknowledge that my notes here, just a couple of the pages, were scribbled before COVID-19, before the racist murders of George Floyd and other people of color, before the January 6th coup attempt, war in Ukraine, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, before so very much. Metaphorically yellowed with age, these are notes from a lifetime ago, or so it's tempting to say, even though there was no lack of violence and injustice in the so-called before times. Indeed, I'm forced to ask myself, how careful, I wonder, are my field notes? And I don't mean this in terms of their artistry, their inscription. Let me do something of a readout from these notes. I sit at the foot of a redwood tree, the ground around it bibbed with russet needles, cones, bark, a few bottle green branchlets that have dropped from high above. Fog drip cools the understory space, while further inland from this forest, the land withers and burns. As I sit, the duff below me compresses, and below that further still is soil grown over millennia. How deep the soil is, I can only wonder. I look out across redwood fidelity plants, sorrel, trillium, and fern, each adapted for photosynthesis in the forest dimness. Above them, higher but not as tall as the redwoods, of course, are azalea, madrone, California bay, and tan oak showing signs of sudden oak death. An appealing understory, to be sure, but it is nevertheless also an omen of extreme wildfire destruction. Too much fuel in the understory. I hear the rub of my heels on the ground and wind sweeping branches above me. A Steller's jay rasps, a woodpecker knocks out a meal. Still, I hear little of the forest's deep bioacoustics, and I catch only top notes of its scentscape, mere hints of ecological exchange and struggle. And I'm not trained at all, by no stretch of the imagination, to identify and measure the effects of atmospheric pressure change, changing carbon dioxide levels, the presence of nitrogen-fixing bacteria, fungal networks, and microarthropods, the flow of xylem and phloem, or the damage of mealybugs and heart rot to the sequoias themselves. Still, my field notes offer an earthy sort of record, one that swells into memory and into this description. But as I do this readout from these notes, I find that they demonstrate a larger problem. The desire to fathom the depths of perception, reach the height of description, to, quote, capture the uncapturable, unquote, as the novelist John Fowles once wrote, writing about trees, in fact. This problem shows up repeatedly in the tree wit that has sprung up amid mega droughts and mega wildfires, forests burning and bulldozering, state-sponsored or otherwise, and ghost forests caused by saline seeping into shoreline forests. Often there's too much entitlement in the author's yearning to entangle the self with others, and I include myself in this diagnosis. On the final page of my notes, however, I wrote a few words that I hope will move me past such yearning. How does one tell a tree or forest story? Now, I'm an art historian. I don't normally engage with story and narrative, and there are those in the audience who do this on a routine basis, and I welcome your suggestions. But story and narrative is where I am with this forest, and I'll proceed accordingly. Most of us certainly know at least an arboreal story or two. It might be an indigenous story or scenes from Gilgamesh, the Lord of the Rings perhaps, a folktale, a romantic poem. There are dozens of novels, still more nonfiction and memoir. Arboreal stories appear in the visual arts, performance, and resound in music. There's environmental forest journalism, scientific publication, public-facing science writing, and report after report, as we know, concerned with the fate of forests. Even so, I keep coming back again and again to the question, how does one tell a tree or forest story? I don't have a complete answer by any means. I also don't think we should find a complete answer. Now, this question, how does one tell a tree or forest story, is the sort of high altitude and weightless question we tend to pose in the humanities, or at least it seems to me. We sense the question's inclination, but it gives us little to work with. Which trees or forests are we talking about? Who is the storyteller? What language are they using, or languages? Where is the tale told? In a forest, at its edge, on paper, in a museum gallery, and so on. Clearly, we're to pull this question down to earth, carry it some distance until we come out somewhere. And our answer, if we arrive at one, may be another question, another story altogether. Perhaps this is nothing less than the intrinsic work of the humanities. And since we're talking about trees, it would be wise, I think, to pay some attention, or in fact, a great deal of attention to botany and ecology. Listen to our colleagues on the other side of the campus, so to speak. But also because we're talking about stories, scientific or poetry or whatever format might be, we're also interested in how things are told and how it feels to hear them or read or see them. None of which is simple, of course. The premise of telling a tree or forest story, I think, demands quite a lot of scrutiny. For as Amitav Ghosh has reminded us in many of his books, our stories arise from particular ways of relating to each other and to others with whom we perceive great distance or difference. And it depends upon the languages in which we invest authority. As Robert Macfarlane points out, even the English words tree and forest are tangled, as he writes, in political histories of access and ownership. A forest, J.B. Jackson once wrote, is a space with its own special law, and he's thinking about jurisprudence. He's thinking about legal systems. And this is true in some worlds, many that we are very closely familiar with. But in other worlds, there is no single word for tree or forest and no private ownership. An arboreal story may thus be troubled and troubling. Colonialism, neoliberalism, and green capitalism produce particular arboreal lives, landscapes, and stories that threaten and destroy arboreal species, communities, knowledge, and representation. A politics of arboreal care would disclose these stories, but also, I truly believe, should turn us towards stories of freedom, the joyous fight for life, as Fabio Zucker writes. Regenerative forest stories, stories of open space protection and conservation. Forest occupation stories sung by activists the poet Stephen Collins calls the biotariat. Stories against chainsaws, logging trucks, and private security. And also, we should be turning towards stories of arboreal posthumanism and arboreal possibilism. I'm not a fan of transhumanism, on the other hand, but that's a conversation for another time. At the very least, we should think twice before speaking for trees and for arboreal communities. So what happens when an arboreal story worries us? This is intentionally disfocused. This is how the artist has rendered this image. But what happens when we're worried by the story that we hear, that we see, that we read? What forms of resistance will this story provoke? Political action, local, national, and global, creative action, academic, pedagogical action. There are many forms of action. It is also possible thinking of story, that we will respond with counter-narrative, diffractive reading, discombobulating reading, and other forms of approaching the text and the space of the text, the context of the text in different ways than might have been intended by the text itself, and also to think of restoration. Stories told to untell stories that worry us, concern us, not to erase them, but to disarrange them so we can think again, think anew, and indeed think and speak with others. Here then is one story from the forest of my field notes seen earlier, a story whose untelling might encourage a politics of arboreal care. I think many of you know where I'm heading, but bear with me here. It's August 1892. If you happen to be white, male, and a member of San Francisco's Bohemian Club, a banker, a judge, a politician, a railroad baron, big agricultural landowner, or for that matter, an academic at Stanford, at the University of California in Berkeley, or an artist or musician, you opened your mail one morning to find a hand-delivered invitation to the club's summer encampment, which read in part, "In Buddha's great name, you are bidden to the sermon of the myriad leaves, in dedication of Bohemia's Redwood Temple, September 3rd, 1892. As the Bohemian Club's official record, published in 1900, explains, such forest encampments enabled its members to drop the masks and costumes of the money-getter and become again as nature made them, quoting from the Annals. Among towering trees and the shaded understory, one could forget that ever man, and man in the gendered sense seems appropriate here, that man was ever born to toil. This is again a male social club. The term Redwood Temple, meanwhile, stands out, though it is not entirely original. It surely echoes William Cullen Bryant's exclamation that the groves were God's first temples, and perhaps Charles Baudelaire's nature is a temple of living pillars. In any case, tickets to this summer event for the Bohemians were $5, or about $150 today. And in preparation, one packed one's outdoor clothing, a wool hat, bed linens, a flask with one's favorite whiskey, perhaps, a book or two, perhaps an instrument, drawing, painting tools, anything that we would think to bring into the forest for your pleasure, for your edification, to be with the forest. Now, to get to the Redwood Temple, one took the ferry to Sausalito from San Francisco, or the ferry first to San Francisco, and then one hopped on a train to Mill Valley, caught a carriage up to what is now Panoramic Highway, and then down into what is now, yes, you get it, Muir Woods National Monument. Now, before that forest that we call Muir Woods today, or some of us call Muir Woods, became a national forest in 1908, a national monument. It was for millennia part of the homeland of the Huayman group of the Coast Miwok people. Following Spanish colonization and land theft, the creation of Rancho Sausalito and other properties, the forest was purchased by the Tamalpais Land and Water Company. And in 1892, members of the Bohemian Club acquired 50 acres of the forest, which is now called Bohemian Grove. And this is only actually a small portion of what constitutes the some 500 acres of Muir Woods today. Here we're looking on one side on the right at a recent map, and you can see the Redwood Creek that winds down through this valley, which is actually quite better described as a canyon with multiple side canyons going off on each direction. And you can also see the topography rising up from the canyon eventually to the Panoramic Highway or Throckmorton Ridge to the east, and then moving towards the Pacific on the west. On the other side here, you see an early map of the Land and Water Company holdings with designations for some of the particular locations that are found today in Muir Woods. Now, as campers, the Bohemians certainly didn't rough it. They had walk-in tents with cots, even rugs on the floor or the ground. They had well-built latrines, kitchens with cooks brought in from the city, candlesticks and linens. There was music. There was staff to do the cleaning up. And in recent lingo, they were glampers, glamorous campers. They were certainly not the ancestors of Julia Butterfly Hill and other tree-sitting activists. These are actually photographs from the amazing collection in the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley. And these are all photographs that were from the Oliver family. And I believe one of their members was a club member and was basically charged with documenting the event. And you'll see a few more of these photographs. Now, during the encampment, the Bohemians walked among the trees, as one might expect, wandered up the hillsides. They held lectures and readings, gathered around the campfire, drank and sang, excuse me. But there had to be a main event, something to centralize to sort of create the climax of this encampment. The encampment itself probably lasted about a week for most of the Bohemians, or maybe even 2 weeks. But there had to be something really big, a theatrical extravaganza based on a myth from the ancient world, a European folktale, one of Shakespeare's plays, or something more exotic, and spare no expense and labor. For the big performance in 1892, the club appointed its member, the sculptor F. Marion Wells, not all that famous, although he did the statue of the Goddess of Progress that was placed on the San Francisco City Hall and somehow more or less survived the 1906 earthquake. Anyway, Marion Wells is not one of the sort of the pinnacles of American sculpture in the late 19th century. But nevertheless, Wells was commissioned to construct a 30-foot tall, or maybe 40-foot, or maybe 60-foot, depending on what you're reading, statue of a Buddha. Now, some of you know about this. Some of you have seen photographs of this, and maybe even this photograph. And I have to say, although it is legible as a Buddha, and the expected iconography is there, I won't go into it, I'd say it's hardly very elegant. The club, however, was very fond of its Buddha, apparently, and they referred to it, and this seems a little bit too significant to just let it go without comment, as the Great White Buddha. Now remember, this is an all-male white men's club. I think there's also a chromatic aesthetic choice here related to having a monumental statue that somehow has to stand out from the coloration of the forest. So I'm not going to do a simplistic racialized reading here, but nevertheless, it is a little bit uncanny or uncomfortable. Here you can see the statue of the Buddha produced by Wells and a number of his assistants. You can see that it is placed in a kind of opening among the trees, and one could approach the statue along this avenue in which the earth has been pounded. You see there's no understory herbaceous growth, and there are simulated stone walls along either side, topped with Japanese-style lanterns. And you can actually see below the hands of the Buddha a number of figures standing, and we'll see a photograph of that more clearly in a moment. Now, as for the construction itself, Wells and his assistants surely had a tough time with it. They're working outdoors. It's actually fairly cold and chilly in August in Muir Woods, if you've been there during the day. They're also working on uneven ground, and they are building this thing from a pine board kind of frame onto which they put plaster of Paris soaked burlap sacks or fabric, which they layered and shaped and molded across. There might have been some kind of cotton batting or something also. In any case, all of this material was moved in, brought in, hauled in from the city. Again, either from San Francisco or from Mill Valley up the ridge and then down into the valley. And in the photograph on the right, you can actually see over here on the sort of the bottom below the statue, you can see sort of the barrels of what I think would have been the white plaster of Paris. And this is before it is completed. You can see ladders on the back of the statue. Now, I think we could perhaps admire the engineering here. We could admire the logistics here, but it was never intended to be permanent. And certainly the plaster of Paris, unadorned, it's not covered with anything protective, would have worn down with the moisture coming down from the canopy, and then with rains and wind and so forth. This was what we would call a temporary art installation. And by the early 20th century, not much of it remained. It was mostly dismantled, in fact, and parts of it were just sort of falling apart. And the question is there anything archaeologically to be found of the statue? But we can come back to that later. The sculptor Wells's Buddha was not strictly of his imagining, but in fact, it was modeled after one of the Buddhist wonders of the East, the great bronze Buddha of Kamakura, Japan. We know this specifically from a number of different texts of the time and then the 1900 annals. The Kamakura Daibutsu, as it was called, was famous for its exposed setting with conifers surrounding it. And to most Western travelers, it was famous for a sort of contemplative philosophical aura. A number of club members themselves saw it firsthand in Japan during their grand tours of Asia in the 1880s. A number of them actually did sketches and paintings. And one came across this Buddha in newspaper photographs and illustrations in San Francisco, quite frequently, actually. And indeed, one could say that it was a Buddha of transnational visibility, a synecdoche of Japan. Even so, there are a number of things that distinguish the two, that make the Great White Buddha look different from the Kamakura statue. And indeed, there's something quite peculiar about its facial features. It's a bit jowly or bearded. The nose is a bit high, enough so that the statue may have doubled, in fact, as a portrait of the club's president at the time, George Bromley, seen here from the San Francisco Call newspaper, a bit later after the fact. Now, if this hypothesis is correct, what we seem to find here is that George Bromley has become an avatar of the Buddha in this redwood temple. We'll see George Bromley again, actually. Now, the Bohemians themselves were actually quite well aware of Buddhism to the extent that it was understood in this period as it was coming in predominantly through Europe, but also to some degree through the returning Christian missionaries coming from Japan back to the Pacific coast, and also from Japanese priests who were beginning to travel to the United States to promote Buddhism and also to meet with Japanese diaspora communities. Lectures on Buddhism were frequently given by theologians in San Francisco. Travelers came back and gave talks about the great Buddhist temples they'd seen, and there were regular newspaper articles debating Buddhism and describing temples in Asia, and also addressing the rising industrial might of Japan and a range of different geopolitical issues related to American empire in the Pacific in relationship to Asia. In 1889, however, the Bohemians themselves got a really big dose of Buddhism as it was translated in Europe, thanks to a dinner they hosted for Sir Edwin Arnold. Arnold, as some of you know, was the author of a very important best-selling biography of the Buddha titled The Light of Asia. This is one of the most important English translations of the narrative life of the Buddha to make the rounds in Europe and North America, published in 1879. Even so, despite this knowledge, despite these inklings and some cases the direct experience of temples in Asia, the Bohemians were really not at all what we would call Buddhists. They might have been sort of Buddhist spiritualists of some sort. And it also is the case that this Buddhist icon, Buddhist statue that they constructed was nothing like an icon that they would have seen in a Buddhist temple in Asia. And then the great big extravagant event they held in front of the Buddha, the pageant they performed in front of it, is very far from anything that we would recognize as Orthodox Buddhist ritual. You can already begin to see why. There are a number of photographs that depict the club members standing with, before, around, or near the Buddha, dressed in fantasies of Buddhist robes. Some of them are wearing cotton kimono brought over from Japan. Some of them are wearing what appeared to be just bed sheets done up as kimono. Some of them are wearing what appeared to be priest surplices. And the main performers of the event, seen on the right, wear a mitre-like headgear that evokes the Ku Klux Klan hood, but I think predates the emergence of that particular headgear. This is apparently what one wore to the grand event performed in front of the Buddha, which the club called the Sermon of the Myriad Leaves. We'll come back to these photographs again. On the night of September 3rd, 200 or so Bohemians gathered by lamp and torchlight at the Buddha. They'd had a full day of wandering around the trees, playing games, reading poetry, playing music, and so forth, and now it was time for the main event. George Bromley, as the high priest of this event, and other members who had been appointed the priests of the leaves and trees, stood at the foot of the Buddha facing the rest of the club. And here you can see George Bromley. I don't know if my cursor is visible here. Yes, just barely. He is at the center, and you can also see the others arrayed behind him, each of them standing behind a kind of a podium, or a kind of a sort of an altar-like structure. Before the priests lies a coffin prepared for cremation, this rectangular white thing that you see here. And in this photograph, which was taken the morning after the event, and that's evident because both of the direction of the light coming down, but also because the contents of this coffin, it was an effigy, have been reduced to ash. So the event has taken place the night before this photograph was taken. I'll come back to this coffin, and I'll come back to its cremation of its contents later. But here again, you can really see the kind of ecclesiastical fantasy, the kind of ritual organization of the Bohemians at the base of the Buddha. There's one other element here which is a little bit obscure, but those of you who are familiar with the Bohemian Club will know that another kind of key motif, or perhaps even the Bohemian mascot, is the owl. And this is a very small statue of an owl on a kind of a brass tripod that is facing the Bohemian priests on the altar. Now, the sermon itself commenced at the sound of a gong, which led to music by, of all people, Mendelssohn, which was then followed by a welcoming address, either by George Bromley or one of the other officiants. Then there were lengthy poems offered by the different priests. I'm going to read you this portion recited by the former Argonaut turned Adjutant General of California and also Ambassador to Korea at one point, Lucius H. Foote. Now this is only about 25% of his poem, so you can see that they had a lot to say. So Foote writes and recited, "Convened in the forest and couched on the sod, we bow to the symbol and worship the god. The smoke of his incense is rising on high. The arch of his temple is spanned by the sky. It is jeweled with stars and cloistered by trees. It is flecked by the moon and fanned by the breeze. His priests at the altars are standing apart. They see with the spirit and hear with the heart. His edicts are wordless, yet fixed and sublime, far wiser than wisdom and older than time. To him, the eternal, sing paeans of praise, incarnate, almighty, all-seeing, unseen, the master, the maker, benign and serene. The voices of nature intone and adore, with thunder of billows that break on the shore. The worlds in their orbits wheel onward above, the fruit of his law and the proof of his love. Not the crowning moments of American poetry, and not a very good reading on my part, but Foote's verse and those of the other priests cast a Buddho-transcendentalist sort of spell across the proceedings, intoning the virtues of the forest and ancient Buddhas, singing of the divine and eternal, of bliss overcoming pain and loss, and a return to primeval nature with a capital N. The Buddhist priests who had traveled from ancient India to Japan and erected splendid temples and statues were all praised, but so too were the redwood tree and those who venerated it. The Bohemians, of course, the redwood tree, even older than the Buddha, embodying nature herself. And the Bohemians, of course, being the quintessential devotees of a new deity, effectively the redwood god itself. Not in an indigenous sense of the sacred, but in a kind of Emersonian understanding of something beyond the human, something cosmic, something spiritual. Now, this sermon concluded, as I noted before, with a cremation. And again, we're seeing a detail of that photograph, and you can see part of the coffin, or in fact, the coffin placed on a kind of platform. This was the cremation of an effigy of the nemesis of the Bohemian Club, a figure the club referred to as Care, with a capital C. Care was, quote, that enemy of mankind, the sworn foe of Bohemia. Care who embodied the malaise-inducing world of capital and politics. Everything one should leave behind when entering the Redwood Temple. Now, cremation, by the way, was not unheard of in the United States in the late 19th century, for though it was deemed heathen by many, was roundly criticized by Christian theologians, it drew the attention of others who had gained knowledge of Hindu and Buddhist funeral practices, as well as philosophy and ritual to some degree. How many Bohemians left instructions for their own cremation, I don't know, but this was a symbolic body incinerated to, as the Bohemians put it, remove all prejudices, resentments, and harmful thoughts so as to forgive and forget. Okay, now a little bit of a pivot. And I'm going to be gradually moving away from this story. Now, coming across the story of redwood camping, a 30-foot Buddha, priests, and cremation, I think we're permitted a bit of astonishment. Who would think, right? A few of us may even wish the statue remained today in Muir Woods, and what a sight that would be. But let's think about the implications and impacts with which I've become implicated by repeating this story. I think there are reasons to risk its repetition, however, to consider and challenge its claims, and to refuse the distance from others that this story discloses and may still induce upon us hearing it again. So let me move from the forest to San Francisco, from San Francisco to colonial ecology, and eventually to decolonial and indigenous knowledge a little bit, to the extent that I should speak or am able to speak to it, and then return to the question of arboreal story. Now let's set aside the Orientalism of the great Buddha and the Redwood Temple. I can talk at length about that if you want later, but you may have noticed that in this tale that I've just sort of retold, there's something of a modern quest story of heroes seeking refuge in nature in order to live freely, indeed to live without a care in the world. One can appreciate the desire for carefree ease, but what about caring for and with others? Care as given rather than taken, empathetic, and mutual care. For the Bohemian, there appears to be a deep desire to merge the self with nature, with a capital N, but this involved a particular species to species pairing with the redwood. Forest was synonymous with the redwood. The rest was circumstantial nature, if mostly pleasant to the senses, and sometimes not. This was, to put it one way, an arboreal fetishizing that subordinated other species in the forest and excluded other people from the redwood temple. Not that the Bohemians were entirely ignorant of botany and ecology, or specifically settler colonial botany and ecology. Redwoods had been classified by Western botany in 1847, and there was a growing knowledge of the genus Sequoia's fossil record, its remaining habitat along the West Coast, of gymnosperms, fire resilience, and so on. And this was due partly to the establishment of the California Academy of Sciences in 1853. And indeed, San Francisco and the Bay Area was a hotbed of settler colonial botany, botanists tromping all over the place. Indeed, the first catalog of Bay Area plants was published in 1870 by the California Academy of Sciences curator Henry Bolander, himself a Bohemian Club member. The botanist Hans Baer, also a club member, identified redwood affinity plants such as bellflower and huckleberry in Marin County. At the University of California, Joseph LeConte wrote about redwoods in his 1888 Evolution and its Relation to Religious Thought. And although she was excluded from the club by gender, Bay Area botany owed a great deal to the botanist Alice Eastwood, seen here. The sort of nature that rank and file Bohemians preferred, however, was not that of taxonomy and evolution, but the nature of Ralph Waldo Emerson. They desired what the Emerson scholar David M. Robertson describes as the transformative beauty of nature, the capacity of creation to evoke a new energy within the human psyche that found unity with the immanent vital energy of the natural world, and in turn, truth and spiritual realization. The immense, seemingly eternal redwoods were the touchstones, if you will, of Bohemian transformation. As the Berkeley botanist and club member William Setchell put it, the redwoods are the trees of our glorious heritage. The redwood was the symbolic ancestor of the Bohemians, which is not at all the same as an evolutionary ancestor, or for that matter, an ancestor in native ontology and forest kin. Bohemian forest belief was a philosophical and aesthetic conjuncture of the American translation of the Parisian La Vie Bohème, idolizing artistic and cultural life in opposition to the work ethic, marketplace, and moralism, conjoined with the curative and transformative powers of nature. Now, the Bohemians were clearly not utopian socialists. There were quite a number in California at this time. They were, as we would say today, to put it one way, bobos, caring mostly indeed about themselves. The forest, meanwhile, was a sphere of private existence for them, a space not of radical anti-modern resistance, but of what we would call white care. It was individualistic, privileged forest bathing, a century before that fad was born. Moreover, the thesis of Bohemian nature north of San Francisco required its urban antithesis. Indeed, by 1890, San Francisco was a major, if not massive, imperial port city with a population, maybe not massive by today's standards, but with a population of 300,000. The demand for housing, water, food, commodities, and transport in this post-gold rush era led to massive development with corresponding congestion, noise, and pollution. The hills were carved up, built on, and cobbled. Fill was dumped into the bay to expand the land. Tons of wood were burned for heating and for industrial manufacturing. Smelting and tanning poisoned the soil and water. Sewage flowed into the bay through the sewers that were built, or when they failed, backed up into the streets, and so on. The white elite worried about dysentery, cholera, and typhoid, which were rampant across the city. They worried about also race, class, and gender conflict, with Asian communities, emancipated Black slaves, recent European immigrants, and women demanding suffrage. And while the Bohemians viewed Japan as the civilized Asian nation, members of the club, such as John H. Bolt, who became the club's president in 1890, were virulent anti-Chinese racists who pushed through the Chinese Exclusion Act and were complicit in the rise of anti-Chinese violence, which did not, of course, prevent some of the Bohemians from making tourist forays into Chinatown to sketch and paint the enclave scenery, to eat at its restaurants, and probably also visit its opium parlors. What the Bohemians witnessed of religious practice in Chinatown's temples, their so-called joss houses, only added to their indulgence in the exotic other. And it was likely that most of them dismissed this religiosity as evil idolatry and found it indicative of Chinese racial and cultural inferiority. This was not the ethereal Buddhism of Japan. This was not the ethereal Buddhism of their Redwood Grove. Now, even though some of the Bohemians lived on Nob Hill, the hill of palaces, as Robert Louis Stevenson described it, even with the planting of Monterey pine and cypress throughout the city to create an urban forest, to make nature beautiful to look upon, as San Francisco's mayor Adolph Sutro put it, and even with the construction of Golden Gate Park, the Bohemians still desired private, what they thought of as pristine forests, without the stone and moral confinements of public parks. The Bohemians' forest quest was, I would say, a matter of white male flight to an arboreal Shangri-La that shielded them from the very systems of inequality and harm through which they acquired wealth and status to begin with, and which allowed them in turn to purchase and escape to their Redwood Temple. Now, we should not ignore the fact that the Bohemian quest was gilded with exclamations such as, exclamations that, while quite hyperbolic, disclose the ideology of manifest destiny, one of which was, all nature shall be ours by right of love and conquest. And indeed, this conquest involved considerable terraforming in the case of the Redwood Temple, aspects of which we still rely upon today. Notably, the Switchback Road we use to descend down into the valley from the east. Many of us have probably driven down this road. Indeed, to reach the forest from Mill Valley, the Bohemians had to build an access road. They paid $7,000 for it, $250,000 in today's currency. And they used a great deal of labor, probably Chinese immigrant labor, to carve the road down from the Marin Ridge into the valley. This was led by a former sheriff of Mill Valley, and again, it probably involved the very people, Chinese immigrant laborers, who were excluded from the club and who were also excluded from the valley itself, the valley being private property. Now, in the valley itself, the club cleared a wagon road along the east side of the creek, built trails through their tract, this 50-acre parcel, and packed areas of the forest floor with tents, dining tables, and the Buddha itself. And in the process, they not only created their temple, they created ready access and spaces for future day tripping and camping, which after the club had their encampment, basically exploded with day trippers coming in from the city, both men and women, and people camping, picnicking, and so forth, swimming in the creek when there was water and so forth. In other words, our experiences in Muir Woods today are built partly upon the club's terraforming and later efforts in the park itself to undo some of this infrastructure. Now, today, the story of the Great White Buddha is an oddity, drawing less attention than stories of 20th century redwood forest conservation and the establishment of Muir Woods. And needless to say, there is more to the story of this forest. And there are reasons to unsettle some of these stories due to their racism and privilege, that of the club and others that was quite literally built into the forest as a space of whiteness and exclusion. But let us move now to the near past, to August 2021, nearly a century after the Great White Buddha. Muir Woods is now filling with people breathing in the clean air and dreaming of a post-pandemic world. And something radical has happened, or as radical as can be expected in a national park. A counter-narrative to the established park history that was engaged through a sort of sign bombing at Muir Woods Founders Grove, so named for Congressman William Kent, the primary benefactor of the purchase of the land that became Muir Woods, for Gifford Pinchot, the head of the US Forest Service at the time, and others. In August 2021, visitors came across an official park sign seen here affixed with a manifesto of sort and post-its and a garland of construction tape. History under construction, we read. Everything on this sign is true, but incomplete. You can see here that there is a sign taped or pasted onto the main official sign, and then down below, you can see yellow post-its. Now, leaving aside the inherent incompletion of histories, forests, and bodies, the ad hoc signage here is a reckoning with racism and exclusion to a point. A social justice intervention made, in fact, by some of the park's younger rangers, which I think of as an act of care. We find new dates added to the standard park chronology, which really began with its establishment as Muir Woods. These new dates challenge the tiny story of saving the redwoods. They are dates that recognize the Coast Miwok and the forest as native homeland for millennia, a place of ancestors and kin, food, medicine, materials, dreams, and stories. The chronology is pulled back before the forest theft from the Coast Miwok, before enslavement, disease, and genocide, before the forest became a trophy of colonization, before private ownership, and before it became a redwood gateway experience for tourists, as my colleague at Berkeley, the archaeologist and Coast Miwok member Peter Nelson has put it. History under construction is a fairly modest, perhaps soundbite, decolonizing action. It affirms the fact that Muir Woods National Park is but a brief moment in native time and in native space. It affirms that there is evolutionary deep time in the forest and also deep human time. As Greg Saris, the chairman of the Federated Indians of Gratan Rancheria, has written, this is the now federally recognized tribe of the Coast Miwok and Southern Pomo. This landscape was our sacred text, he writes, and we listened to what it told us. Everywhere you looked, there were stories. To read this revised timeline is also to reckon with the fact that the forest story is a story of colonial aftermath, and that the oldest trees we see today are witness trees of settler occupation, violence, and exclusion in the name of leisure, beauty, and nation. I may not be the only one to momentarily mistake the construction tape draped over the official sign as crime scene tape. That said, this intervention refuses to consign Native peoples to the past, and it effectively imagines history in the other direction, a near and further future history inclusive of the Coast Miwok and others who have historically been excluded from the forest, African Americans, Latino Americans, and other peoples of color, and also those who are socioeconomically marginalized. The signage here begins to lean towards a future of collective arboreal recognition and care. Now, in no way do I wish to suggest that all is resolved, that a post-colonial Muir Woods has arrived. In fact, it cannot become post-colonial with that very name. To adapt a phrase associated with the Marxist philosopher and critic Frederick Jameson, it seems easier still to imagine the extinction of the redwood trees themselves than it is to imagine this forest becoming truly decolonized. After all, Muir Woods is the property of the settler colonial nation. But even so, there are some signs that the process of decolonizing Muir Woods, the struggle, is taking place. And there are new collaborations between the park and the Coast Miwok community. New public stories are being told. not merely in post-its, but in the education that takes place more broadly in the park. There are stories told in the forest now about the deep racism and exclusion in the park's history, stories against Native peoples, peoples of color, and those without privilege. And there are also stories that behold the forest in the particular conditions of accelerating climate alteration and biodiversity loss, and stories even that touch upon what some of us term earth grief. Not surprisingly, the indigenous and the Anthropocene have come together in this forest. And one of those converged stories concerns fire. No surprise there, I think. Tree ring analysis shows us that in Muir Woods, natural fires swept through this forest for centuries, every 25 years or so, quite frequently. And they had vital ecological benefits to the trees and the forests. As Park Ranger Mio Monroe puts it, fire will race up a redwood and it will glow, but it won't burn down. And the fire keeps pathogens and fungus in control and from reaching epidemic proportions. This is actually still a major threat in the forest, specifically for heart rot. After disastrous National Park Service no-burn policies, and as we hope to reduce the mega wildfires that obliterate forests and ecosystems by returning to control and periodic forest burns to reduce fuel load, it is clear that native ecocultural fire knowledge and practice must be part of our stewardship of Muir Woods and other forests, both in national parks and on private property. We need all of the tools of fire, our understanding of fire, to protect, if we can, the forest. And in fact, there are plans for burns at the upper outer reaches of the forest to create defensive perimeters around the redwood trees themselves. And this is a photograph on the right of a fire scar in a fairly old tree, a tree probably about 500 or 600 years old. Even so, there remains the deeper question of restitution in response to colonial land theft and occupation, and how that could produce new ways to engage care with and for people and species and communities in this and of this forest. It remains to be seen whether native knowledge that cares for sacred and communal relationships will be merely heard in conversations about Muir Woods ecosystem and its future, or whether the Coast Miwok will recover rights of stewardship, gathering, and other forms of use in the forest itself, if they so desire. For a national park, such restitution would indeed be quite radical, but we do now have a Native American head or secretary of the Department of Interior, Deb Howland. We now have a director of the National Park Service, Charles Sams, who is also a Native American. In fact, there are redwood forests whose stewardship is being turned over to tribes already. There is a tract purchased by the Save the Redwoods League that is now being stewarded by either the Yurok or the Kuruk community. Visiting Muir Woods today will remain astonishing. And passing through Founder's Grove, one will notice that the post-its are now permanent in a new sign. It's about time, one might say, even if a sign, an official sign or a protest sign cannot be the end of the story, particularly where social and ecological justice are concerned. Some signs, I'm told, at Muir Woods today will also come down, including the sign you see here, which some of you have seen before, I suspect, which is adjacent to the Bohemian Grove where the Great White Buddha originally sat. Once this sign is gone, with its photographs of the Buddha and of Bohemian campers, we will probably look at this part of the forest more as a forest simply being a forest moving on with its own story, as it will, as much as it can. In the face of what now seem like signs preceding the end of the world, again, Herrera's phrase, we need now more than signs and stories. We need new forms of consciousness, not merely the consciousness that emphasizes individualized depth experience, as some call it, getting away from our phones and our algorithms to be grounded, to be centrally alive. But what we may need is what could be called a collective set of care experiences. Collective rather than individualized, experiences that are empathetic, that are witnessing, but also, as Louise Bocacci describes, witnessing, empathetically witnessing with others. These would be care experiences that take place in a forest, any forest, with trees, any tree, and not just a forest of charismatic megaflora. Indeed, they should take place everywhere we can possibly make them happen. Story or narrative still matters greatly in this because it can draw us into intimacy with the signs of the world that are not strictly those of our own species, the signifying trees and ecological assemblages of species, for instance. Stories matter because it is one way to enliven and share data, material, feeling, and acknowledgement, and imagination. It is one of the most powerful ways to effect change. Indeed, to become other than who we once were, or thought we were, or think we are, through care-centered relationships. Now, it is of course for the Coast Miwok themselves to decide when and where to tell their own stories and to whom they tell them. But perhaps native stories will be told in this forest, some of us call Muir Woods. At the very least, we should honor the presence of multiple stories in and of this forest and be careful of making claims upon them. Even if Muir Woods continues to be, in Terry Tempest Williams' words, a place of probity, where the evolutionary processes of life are free to continue, our careful beholding of its trees and ecosystem will require stories that first ask, how far is the distance between us as people and species? And stories that respond in turn, not far at all. Given the degradation of our biosphere, ecocide, and environmental injustice, we will need more than big data, big geoengineering, big intergovernmental meetings. We will need to recognize care for other forms of bigness. We will need to recognize care in other forms of bigness, from the tallest trees to the scale of evolutionary and ecological relationship evident even in the smallest species. We will need everything that language and visual and material representation allow us to do, and we must also be willing to unsettle ourselves as we listen to, read, watch, and tell stories. To care for this redwood forest, then, is to face material choices, choices also about what is valued, and choices about story and restoration. It is also to ask, I think, how do we care for the stories of others? How do we care for the places of other stories? How do we care for these places so that we may ourselves come to tell new and different stories, stories of care with and for others? Thank you. I would be happy to take questions. I'm eager to hear your thoughts, questions, and otherwise. Yes, there is a mic to be passed around for those with questions. I have a question right off. How many of you have been to Muir Woods? How many of you have seen that sign with the photograph of the Great White Buddha? Okay. It's still there. It may come down, but it's still there. Questions? Yes.
Consider the or entail.
The question is, what do I have thoughts about renaming the woods, what that might mean or entail? I love that question. I love it in a kind of very immediate institutional way because at Berkeley, we have changed the name of the law school, for example. And I think that this is obviously a very interesting way to engage the very questions of what we might generally call monuments. Monuments that are physical, sculptural, for example, but also monuments that are of quote unquote nature. And so we have obviously a very complex and critical unfolding story about monuments that embody racism, racist histories being removed. The removal is obviously, as many of us are aware, a tricky maneuver because of the concern on the part of some of erasing histories of trauma, histories of violence, and on the other hand, the quest for freedom, the struggle to understand places, people, histories, stories in different ways comes into that conversation. I would very much like to see Muir Woods renamed. John Muir himself held views that I think were the antithesis of the care that I'm talking about. But more importantly, I think it is to speak to a longer history, a broader history, and inclusive history. What that name might be, however, is something I would like to listen to people. I would like to listen to elders of any category of indigenous, scientific, artistic, and so forth. That could be itself a very interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I missed the first 15 minutes, so if you address this, then please, we can go on to the next question. I'll watch the video later. But I'm very curious about the tension between how you use the term care and how it was articulated in that particular phase of the Bohemian Club. Is there something productive about that tension, something that we can learn about the way the term is being used in these different ways?
Thank you. Yeah, so the sort of the tension here quite accurately is to describe that I'm sort of instigating is between care as a negative, the cares of the world, the cares that we carry and are burdened with, which was really the essentially the key ethos or part of the key Bohemian ethos. And of course, it's a very specific notion of care that is predicated on the modernity, the bourgeois sort of ailments, especially of these male figures, as they were emerging out of the gold rush and the Civil War era, but merging into tremendous wealth and privilege in this booming urban environment. At the same time that I think that many of us are engaging areas in the humanities and elsewhere where the very question of what care signifies, means, what care feels like, and the ways in which care becomes a form of resistance itself are very present, proximate to us. They're part of our lived embodied experiences. And care has now been sort of amplified and sort of zoonotically in terms of the medical system, but there are other sort of dynamics of care that run across racial, social, gender, justice. I wanted to provoke that tension because I think that that question of care also is at the heart of what a lot of writers about post-humanism and indigeneity are trying to bring together. What I'm really interested in is how we can then ground that. This we see in many different community-based scholarship, research programs, also the work of communities themselves. How does that operate in the humanities itself? How does it work in the academy? And part of what I'm interested in is trying to throw myself in and even indict myself into the question of what does it mean for me to care about what it is I do, being a settler by heritage, being an academic in privilege, but also concerned about relationships. And I'm concerned about care right now because of the massive labor strike at UC Berkeley and across the UC system also. So it's care between ourselves as people, but also care with other people, other species. And this is where we can learn both from the post-human theory, but also from indigenous and regenerative wisdom and knowledge. So I haven't resolved that tension. And I think we need to struggle with that tension. I don't, in fact, think we should resolve it, because I think we're never ultimately, absolutely, perfectly going to get to freedom. If that works.
Greg, may I add something to that question? Because I was going to ask a similar question, but now hearing your response provokes me to reflect on this, what you just framed as sort of a dichotomy between two senses of care. That we all know what the old Bohemian Grove sense is, to go into the forest to escape from worldly cares, which matters only because most of the time you're in business making money. And so that's sort of how you mask that, by pretending you're disentangling yourself from the world for a temporary vacation. The second sense that you just described is the one that comes out of caregiving, self-care. It has medical and sort of maybe even sort of self-help resonances. I hear in the talk a third sense of care, and you're framing it as two, but this is why I think it's three. The third one for me is exemplified by the Post-its on the sign, which is not caregiving, not self-care, but rather what I would call sort of critical care. That is a kind of caring that is not enmeshed in the history of a certain moment, but is actually trying to analyze and master history by proposing a counter narrative. And so I wonder whether the tension between those two things could possibly be resolved by separating out some of the instances that you're describing and recategorizing them, reconceptualizing them a little bit. Anyway, I'd love to hear your reaction. Just a thought.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I think the critical care is, I think, something that does negotiate or constellate the notion of care very productively. What's really interesting is to understand what sort of care was going on in the turn of the century. And there's an article by Cotton Saylor that addresses the sort of the emergence of white care in the late 19th century that I found very, very interesting. And in relationship to self-care. And I think the analytical dimension of criticality or critical care is really very helpful in the sense, at least to the sense that we understand that analytical or that analytic, that countering is not the academy, but there are multiple ways in which critical engagement, as you're saying, that the critical is also embodied and felt, not just mental, cognitive, philosophical. And this is a little bit where I begin to slide a little bit away from the post-human theory, from some of the theoretical writing that I really benefit from and often adore the power and the empowerment of, because I want to know more about the felt criticality, to say it one way, but I also want to learn. I don't want to be speaking the critical. I want to be hearing and learning and feeling the critical as much. So again, I'm trying to step out of that, slightly out of that academic positioning. But I think that by constellating this constellation of care, we begin to find ways in which we notice other modes of care, other forms of care, other actions of care that we may not have seen or understood before.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. I have a question about the ecosystem in Muir Woods in general. So the place is kind of, what's the word, valued for its redwoods, but you mentioned that it's a vibrant ecosystem without them as well. So I was curious about how the narratives or the artworks or any kind of cultural production that's valuing Muir Woods, that's not centering its redwoods, would look like for you, or if that exists, and how to kind of perhaps undo the absence of other species within the place, within the archive, would look like for you?
That's a wonderful question. It's so striking how iconic the redwood has become and how, in a sense, anti-ecological that signifying process is to the ecology. And when I've talked to forest ecologists, and in fact, I'm going to go here to show one of my colleagues, Joe McBride, a forest redwood ecologist. Joe has looked at every redwood tree in the park and measured all the stumps. And he commented to me at one point when we actually on this trip, and this is with the hat, that's Mia Monroe, the former site superintendent. He commented about how he found that the redwoods were not necessarily the only thing that we should be studying, and yet most of the attention and most of the policy or in public knowledge seems to go there. I'm meandering towards an answer to your question. Ecologically speaking, it is a system, and why not culturally, ecologically as well? What we seem to find with photography is a kind of a negotiation between that. And once you begin to look more intensively at the state of the forest, and you begin to see the terraforming that has taken place there, you begin to see that there are opportunities to acknowledge and to represent and to tell stories. So something I didn't include in the talk is a lot of the conservation effort that's going on now, pre-pandemic and through the pandemic, one of the most important being the complete kind of re-envisioning and restructuring of the creek so that the salmon run can come up from the Pacific. And this suggests, I think, all sorts of opportunities for narrative, for story, for education, and for representation, for visual material art. I would love to see artists brought in as artists in residence into the forest. I would love to see what they could do that negotiate that charismatic megaflora in relationship to the micro-charismatic or the integration, the charisma of the integrations of things. I hope that got somewhere towards your question.
Let's take two more before we break, one from the in-person audience and one from the remote
Yes,
audience.
please.
In person?
I was wondering how you find yourself engaging or speaking with people who don't see care the way you see it.
With people, how do I engage with people who don't see care as I see it?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a very powerful question. I'm still learning to see care. I'm still learning to understand the forms of care that not just matter for me, but to be attentive to what care means, different places, different communities, different individuals. And in some cases, there isn't a tension. It's really actually about understanding that I've encountered. I encountered this as a department chair, actually. What are the ways through which the conversation of care can unfold? What do I need to know a little bit to begin to think empathetically? There are instances in which the care that I can envision or the care that I hold important run counter to forms of care that are institutional, that are national. My partner and I were just at Muir Woods, was that yesterday or 2 days ago? 2 days ago, talking with Mia Monroe, the former site superintendent. And it's so interesting to hear how everybody there cares deeply about this forest. And there are also real efforts to deeply care about those who've been excluded from it. But it is still a national park. It is still subject to Department of Interior funding. Thankfully, refunded now under the Biden administration with a different leadership. But it is still a constellation of institutional and national frameworks that I can feel a kind of a place where I can run into it, or I can begin to understand it as much as I can from the outside. The same happens with the notions of care that I hold when I've spoken to colleagues who are tribal members, and trying to listen first is so important, because so much of the care that I have developed, I mean, one of the things I care about is the caring about knowing. I want to know, which is about truth and reality derived from the Enlightenment. And it is so out of place so often. I should not desire to know, I should desire the opportunity to learn in many, many instances. So I've not had to avert collisions, but it's really to try to have conversations that bring about a space where care could happen, whatever form of care is caring. To put it one way. Thank you.
Okay, so this will be the last question, and it is from a member of the remote audience. Trees are large and important. They provide us a lot. To what extent is our historic view or association with trees and forests deeply egocentric or self-serving, i.e., as humans, we found trees to be useful for food, lumber, shade, or shelter, and that's the lens through which we've always examined trees and forests. How do we escape from that egocentric view of our relationship with trees, or is it possible to escape from it?
I'm going to tell a Zen anecdote. I didn't think Zen would come in today, but it is. I remember when I was in college, at Oberlin College, and the teacher from the Rochester Zen Center came to visit the campus. And, you know, I'm 17 years old. And he gave a talk. We did a brief meditation. I don't remember his name, unfortunately. And somebody asked about whether lettuce feels pain. They said, I'm a vegetarian, but I'm really worried that by eating lettuce that I'm causing pain. Another person said, you know, I really like to go to the disco. You know, is it okay for me to go to the disco? And the Zen teacher was basically responded by saying, we all feel pain and we all like to dance, which I thought was brilliant and very Zen-y at the time. But the fact of the matter is we cannot leave no trace. No species leaves no trace. In fact, the traces we leave in some cases are ecologically necessary. The rotting tree becomes the nursery. It leaves a trace, but it reconnects, regenerates. That said, there are forms of use, forms of extraction, forms of sort of, well, capitalist, neoliberal extraction that harm, that damage, and wound, that I think are distinctive in their particular harms or pathologies, their particular systems. And we find multiple alternative systems of use where use value is understood differently and understood in terms of regeneration, perhaps, or sustainability, or perhaps in terms of care. So there's no question that there are tipping points. There are no questions where at the end of the day, if we lose the remaining intact boreal forests, the atmosphere, the climate, the biosphere is going to collapse. And the questions and the choices are, is there anything we can do before that happens? So I love the question because it forces us to think about use, but also honoring, use and acknowledgement, and use leading to reuse, but also the natural cycles. I the ecological cycles through which things continue and regenerate. That was a big question. I hope I got there somewhere. I mean, there's such a rich history to the use of wood. There's a whole book that's on my shelf about human civilization having been foundationally constructed based on wood. Others say it's based on stone. So a lot more to consider in that. So thank you.